What if the only way to survive was to disappear into the shadows of someone else's world? Elena Martinez spent years cleaning the gleaming floors of the Zenith Tower, a place where luxury and power reign, but none of it ever touched her. Working endless nights, her life was a lonely routine of cold chemicals and distant dreams. But when a single act of cruelty shatters her already fragile existence, everything changes. In a world of glass and steel, Elena finds an unexpected ally in the most unlikely of places, a group of hardened bikers known as the Sentinels. Together they bring her the justice and hope she never thought possible. This is the story of a mother, a daughter, and a fight for a future where the dawn is never cold again. Stay tuned to hear how a simple act of courage ignited a transformation that changed everything. Elena Martinez's calloused hands gripped the aluminum mop handle, the cold of the metal seeping through her thin skin and into her very bones. The harsh, acrid smell of cleaning chemicals stung her nostrils, a hauntingly familiar scent that overpowered even the cold, artificial air pumped out relentlessly by the Zenith Tower's massive ventilation system. Midnight. The world outside the inch-thick glass walls was likely fast asleep. But here on the 72nd floor, in the near-absolute silence of the high-level executive hall, Elena's world consisted of only two sounds. One was the steady, monotonous, dreary scrape of the soaked mop head across the polished black marble floor. The other was the thumping of her own heart, a tired but stubborn beat. She moved the mop in a perfect arc, watching the streak of water spread and then slowly recede. Light from a crystal chandelier worth a fortune, hanging from the soaring ceiling above, shone down, transforming the puddle of dirty water at her feet into a shimmering smear shattered into 1,000 fake diamonds. Elena was all too familiar with this irony. In the Zenith Tower, even filth was dressed in a glittering facade. The Zenith Tower did not sleep. It simply held its breath, waiting for the dawn to be filled once more with people in expensive leather shoes, perfectly tailored suits, and million-dollar phone calls. At night, it resembled a colossal tomb of glass and steel, cold and soulless. And she, Elena Martinez, was the silent guardian of that luxurious emptiness. She knew every hidden corner where dust loved to gather, knew the tiny crack on the 17th marble tile in the west corridor, knew the barely audible creak of the boardroom door. She knew the soul of this building when it was at its most bare and vulnerable. But the building and those who owned it knew nothing of her. To them, she was just a ghost in a gray uniform, a pair of diligent hands ensuring the flawless perfection of their empire. Elena paused, leaning the mop against a wall and straightening her aching back. A dull pain ran down her spine like a weak electric current, a faithful companion after years of bending over cold surfaces. She walked to the enormous glass wall overlooking the city. From up here, the city at night looked like a galaxy spread out on the ground, millions of lights twinkling like distant stars. A breathtaking beauty she never had the time to appreciate. She looked into the glass, and for a moment, the lights behind her and the city lights before her created a faint mirror-like effect. She saw her reflection. A 40-year-old woman with brown eyes sunken from lack of sleep. Her high cheekbones, a mark of her Mexican heritage, were now hollowed, making her face look more gaunt. Her thick black hair was pulled into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, a few stray wisps clinging to her sweaty forehead, and the faint crescent-shaped scar just above her left eyebrow. That scar. It was like a switch throwing open a door in her mind, a door she always tried to keep sealed shut. The smell of chemicals suddenly vanished. In its place, another scent rushed in, vivid and intense, the pungent yet vibrant scent of oil paint. the smell of pine from David's old ladder. Memory is a cruel thief. It doesn't knock. It just barges in, steals your present, and throws you back into a past that can never return. The Elena of 10 years ago was standing on that wooden ladder, a paintbrush in her hand, humming a cheerful Latin tune. She wasn't wearing a gray uniform. She was wearing one of David's old shirts splattered with paint of every color. The brilliant afternoon sun streamed through the window, dancing on the floor of the small apartment they rented. David was standing below, holding the ladder steady, looking up at her with eyes full of adoration. "Be careful, my artist," he said, his smile brightening his entire face. "I know what I'm doing." She laughed in reply, dipping her brush into a dish of bright yellow. She was painting a mural in the tiny room that would soon be Lily's. A giraffe with a long, smiling neck, fluffy white clouds, and a radiant sun in the corner. The scent of oil paint, David's crisp laughter, the sound of the brush gliding across the wall. That was the symphony of her life. He climbed a few rungs, stood behind her, and wrapped his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, admiring the work with her. "It's perfect," he whispered, his warm breath tickling her ear. "It's not finished yet," she said, but her heart was fluttering. The warmth of his hand covering hers, their fingers intertwined, stained with paint, and filled with love. It was a world built of simple dreams and bright colors. A dry beep from the service elevator at the end of the hall pulled Elena back to the present. She blinked. The image of David dissolved. The scent of oil paint was gone. All that remained was the sharp smell of chemicals and the reflection of a lonely, tired woman in the cold glass. She raised a hand to touch the scar. The workshop accident had taken David, and it had taken the artist inside her too. The paintbrushes were packed away, the dreams were sealed shut, and her life was redefined by mops and bottles of chemicals. The body is a traitor, Elena thought. It remembers what the mind tries to forget. It still remembered the warmth of David's hand, still remembered the freedom of creating. But it also remembered the pain, the loss, and now the endless exhaustion. She turned her back on the city, on her own reflection. She picked up the mop. On the other side of this immense hall in the cramped staff break room was her entire world. Lily was asleep, curled up on the old sofa, clutching a threadbare teddy bear that David had given her. Every swipe of the mop, every twinge in her back, every sleepless night in this luxurious tomb served a purpose. That purpose had big, dark, round eyes and a smile that could melt the harshest winter. She was cleaning up other people's filth to keep her daughter's world pure. She was living in a tomb so that one day her little girl could live in a garden. Elena continued her work, moving in silence across the vast hall. Her shadow stretched long across the marble floor, solitary and steadfast. "For you, Lily," she whispered to herself again, and this time the words were not a tired sigh. They were an oath. "It's all for you." The staff break room was a completely different world. It was a small concrete box, hidden behind gleaming corridors and luxurious offices. There was no marble, only linoleum floors that had yellowed with age, scarred with scratches like dried-up rivers. There were no crystal chandeliers, only the harsh blue-white light of a fluorescent fixture that buzzed incessantly. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and a faint mustiness from the worn-out fabric-covered sofa in the corner. This was Elena's oasis, a temporary shelter for mother and daughter in the cold desert of the Zenith Tower. And in that oasis, Lily Martinez was the source of water, the source of light. The little girl wasn't asleep. Elena knew she wouldn't be. The long nights here had taught Lily a strange kind of patience. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her back against the sofa, completely lost in her own world. A worn-out box of crayons, many of them broken in half and carefully wrapped with tape, was spread before her like a treasure trove. A clean sheet of A4 paper, one of the few Elena had managed to get from the stationery room, was a whole universe waiting to be created. Elena stood at the doorway, quietly watching her daughter. The way Lily concentrated was adorable. Her head was tilted slightly, her small tongue peeking out from the corner of her mouth, a habit that only appeared when she was truly focused. Her tiny fingers held a black crayon drawing lines that were shaky yet full of determination. Elena entered, trying not to make a sound. "What are you drawing, mija?" she asked softly, her voice tired but gentle. Lily looked up, her dark eyes lighting up when she saw her mother. "I'm drawing this building," she whispered, as if afraid to disturb the surrounding silence. Elena knelt beside her, looking at the drawing. It was indeed a tall building drawn with childish lines, but still recognizable. But there was something strange. Instead of windows, Lily had drawn horizontal lines that looked like iron bars. And on top of the building where the antenna should have been, she had drawn a face with sad eyes and a downturned mouth. "Why is it so sad, my love?" Elena asked gently, stroking her daughter's soft hair. "Because it's so tall, Mommy," Lily explained seriously. "It's all alone. It must be so cold." Elena's heart tightened. A 5-year-old child able to sense the cold loneliness of this place. She didn't see the glamour, the wealth. She only saw a giant, lonely, and sad creature. Her daughter had a soul far too sensitive for the world they were forced to live in. Lily flipped to another page, a drawing she had finished earlier. This one showed a woman in a gray uniform holding a mop that was taller than she was. The woman looked tired, but she was surrounded by scribbled strokes of bright yellow like a halo of sunshine. "This is you," Lily said, pointing at the drawing. "And what are these yellow strokes?" Elena asked, her voice catching slightly. "That's my love," Lily answered innocently, "so you won't feel cold." Elena couldn't hold back her tears. She quickly turned away, wiping a hot tear that had just rolled down her cheek. The child knew. Somehow she knew everything. She knew her mother was tired, sad, and cold, and she used her cheap crayons to warm her mother up. Her angels didn't have wings. They were made of crayon. "Thank you, mi sol," she whispered, turning back to hug her daughter tightly. "You are my sunshine." She opened her box of cold dinner, taking out the small carton of milk she had saved for the little girl. Mother and daughter sat together, sharing the milk, sharing their warmth in the cold room. "I have one more drawing," Lily said after finishing the last sip of milk. She flipped to the last page, the one she was most proud of. This drawing was completely different. It had no tall buildings or gray uniforms. It showed a small house with a red-tiled roof and a garden full of sunflowers. 2 figures, one large and one small, were holding hands, watering the plants under a radiant sun. "One day we'll have a house like this," Lily said, her voice full of conviction. "A place where we can plant flowers. A place where you don't have to mop anymore. A place where the sunshine is warm when we wake up." She paused for a moment, searching for the words. "It's a place where the dawn isn't cold, Mommy. A place where the dawn isn't cold." That sentence, uttered by a 5-year-old, contained all of Elena's deepest longings. It wasn't a dream of wealth. It was a dream of warmth, of peace, of a normal life that for them was now an unimaginable luxury. Elena was about to say something when the break room door swung open. No knock. no warning. Julian Croft stood there. His presence immediately sucked all the warmth from the room. The fluorescent light seemed to grow colder. The chill didn't come from the air conditioning. It radiated from the man himself. Julian Croft wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit without a single wrinkle. His polished leather shoes stepped onto the cheap floor without making a sound, as if he didn't belong there. He did not look at Elena. His ice-cold gaze swept across the cramped room, stopping on the box of crayons and Lily's drawings scattered on the floor. Elena could see a flicker of disgust in his eyes, the look one gives an insect or a piece of trash. Elena scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding like a drum. "Mr. Croft, sir," she mumbled. He still didn't look at her. His eyes finally left the drawings, but instead of looking at Elena, he stared at a small smudge on the wall behind her. Then slowly, he glanced at her. It wasn't a look. It was a judgment. A silent warning. That gaze said, "Your existence and your child's, this small, filthy world of yours, is an offense to the perfection of this empire. Clean it up." Then he turned and left as abruptly as he had arrived. The door closed behind him, leaving a void filled with cold air and unspoken threats. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were trembling. She looked down at Lily. The little girl was sitting perfectly still, her eyes wide, the crayon having slipped from her fingers. The innocence in her eyes was gone, replaced by a fear that no 5-year-old should ever have to know. Elena's greatest fear was not poverty, not exhaustion, not even Croft's humiliation. Her greatest fear was manifesting right before her eyes. It was the moment the cruel, cold world of Julian Croft began to stain her daughter's purity. She knelt down, hastily gathering the drawings. She didn't just scoop them up. She picked up each sheet one by one, carefully brushing off invisible specks of dust as if they were precious relics. She clutched them to her chest, the flimsy sheets of paper and crayon marks, a fragile paper shield against a world of glass and steel. "It's okay, my love," she said to Lily, but she was really talking to herself. "Everything will be okay." But as she held her daughter, she could feel the little body trembling. And Elena knew that tonight a crack had appeared in the safe world she had tried so hard to build for her daughter. A crack made by the man in the charcoal gray suit, and she didn't know if she was strong enough to mend it. The silence in the break room was shattered by a sudden violent sound. It wasn't human, nor was it mechanical. It was the vibration of the cheap phone Elena had left on the table, a jarring, frantic buzzing, like a venomous snake trapped in a box. Elena flinched, her heart skipping a beat. She knew that number. She knew the way it vibrated, as if transmitting an urgent command, not a normal call. Lily, who had been in the middle of coloring, also looked up, her eyes wide with worry. Elena took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, before swiping the screen to answer. She didn't say hello. She waited. Julian Croft's voice came through the line, a sound honed from ice and contempt, devoid of any human warmth. It wasn't a conversation. It was a decree. "Elena," he began without a greeting. "In 2 hours, I will be hosting an important party in the main hall. Investors from Singapore. I want everything not just clean. I want it to shine." He paused for a second, just long enough for the words to seep into her every nerve. "I want them to have to squint from the gleam of the floor when they walk in. I want them to be able to see their reflections in the conference table. I want every pane of glass, every brass door handle, every single detail to sparkle like a diamond. Do you understand? Tonight this building must shine like a diamond." Elena swallowed hard. Her throat was dry. "Mr. Croft, sir, I'm working on it. But 2 hours is— I'm not asking you if you can do it." Croft's voice cut in sharp as a razor blade. "I'm telling you what you will do. 2 hours. Do not disappoint me." Beep, beep, beep. The line went dead, but his words did not. They hung in the air, turning the stuffy break room into an invisible prison. The diamond must shine. That command wasn't just a work request. It was a threat, a carefully calculated form of psychological torture. Elena shot to her feet, the exhaustion in her body instantly replaced by a cold surge of adrenaline. 2 hours. To turn an entire colossal hall and its adjoining conference rooms into a diamond. It was impossible. It was a task designed for failure, to give him an excuse to unleash his wrath. "Mommy?" Lily's worried voice pulled her back to reality. "It's okay, sweetie." Elena lied, forcing a smile. "Mommy just has to work a little faster. You sit here and be a good girl and draw okay." But Lily knew. Her eyes saw through her mother's clumsy attempt to hide her panic. Elena rushed out of the break room, no longer a slow-moving ghost. She was now a soldier in a war she knew she would lose. The mop was no longer a tool. It was a weapon, an enemy. Her hands gripped it, pushing it with a frantic speed. Sweat began to bead on her forehead, trickling down her temples, tasting of salt on her lips. Every muscle in her back screamed in protest. The dull ache was now an iron claw tearing into her spine. But she ignored it. She pushed, pulled, wrung, and pushed again. The sound of water and cloth scraping against the marble floor created a rushed, panicked rhythm. "The diamond must shine," Croft's voice repeated in her head like a haunting echo. She abandoned the mop, grabbing a bottle of glass cleaner and a stack of clean cloths. She wiped every pane of glass, every metal surface. Her arms ached with fatigue, but she didn't stop. She rubbed and rubbed until her own reflection appeared clearly, a pale face distorted by exhaustion. Then she nearly ran to the conference room where a wooden table as long as a bus stood. She sprayed polishing solution, the strong chemical scent making her cough. She used all her strength to polish every square inch of the tabletop. Circles and more circles until her shoulder felt like it would pop out of its socket. Suddenly, the world around her swayed. The chandelier above blurred, turning into a giant, drifting jellyfish. She staggered, grabbing the edge of the table to keep from falling. The dizziness passed, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth and a ringing in her ears. Her body was protesting. It was begging her to stop. But she couldn't. She saw Lily standing at the doorway, her small eyes filled with fear. The little girl wasn't crying. She just stood there, clutching her teddy bear tightly, watching her mother destroy herself. That sight was more painful than any physical agony. Elena bit her lip hard, the pain helping her to stay alert. "Mommy, can I help?" Lily approached timidly, holding a small cleaning cloth, the one she used to wipe her own little desk. "No, sweetie, go back to the break room. These chemicals aren't good for you," Elena said, panting. But Lily didn't listen. She dipped her small cloth into the bucket of water, trying to wring it out with her weak hands. Dirty water ran down her arm. Then she started wiping the leg of the table, a meaningless task. But it was all she could do. A small, desperate attempt to share her mother's burden. Elena watched, and something inside her broke. The humiliation, the helplessness, and the boundless love mixed together, rising as a bitter, choking wave in her chest. She wasn't just fighting for a job. She was fighting so her daughter would never have to witness this, so she wouldn't have to grow up in the shadow of indignity and oppression. Just then, the sound of luxury car engines began to echo from below. They were arriving. Elena glanced at the clock in shock. Only an hour and a half had passed. Croft had lied. He had deliberately shortened the time to corner her. Sleek black limousines glided into the parking lot like predators. Doors opened. Men in expensive suits and women in glittering evening gowns stepped out. The sound of their laughter floated up clear and distant, like the clinking of crystal glasses. They were another world, a world where Elena's existence was a negligible detail. They entered the hall. Elena was hastily wiping up the last streak of water. They walked right past her. A few glanced her way, not with curiosity, but with absolute indifference. She was part of the scenery, like a potted plant or the sculpture in the corner. The scent of their expensive perfume mingled in the air, a stark, ironic contrast to the smell of her sweat and chemicals. She overheard snippets of their conversation, words like acquisition, profit margin, millions of dollars, soulless and foreign numbers. And then Julian Croft appeared in their midst. He was like a king among his court, a smile on his lips, but not in his eyes. He nodded to his guests, and then his gaze swept across the hall. It wasn't looking for perfection. It was searching for a flaw. And it found one. It stopped on Elena. Croft's expression didn't change. He politely said something to a guest, then broke away from the group. He didn't walk fast. He walked slowly, deliberately towards Elena. Every step he took on the marble floor echoed in her head, not as the sound of shoes, but as the ticking of a time bomb. He stopped in front of her so close she could smell the faint scent of mint on his breath. He didn't look at her. His eyes scanned from the floor up to the freshly polished table, then came to rest on a tiny, almost invisible droplet of water pooled at the base of a chair leg. Only then did he slowly raise his eyes to meet hers. A cold, emotionless gaze. It pierced through her, making her feel naked and small. He glanced at the white gold Patek Philippe on his wrist. Then he spoke, his voice low and clear, just loud enough for her to hear. "You have 10 minutes. With that, he turned, smiled, and rejoined his guests, as if the conversation had never happened. But for Elena, it had happened. It was a sentence. 10 minutes. The air was trapped in her lungs. Her heart hammered like a caged bird, frantically seeking an escape. Her world shrank, reduced to the invisible ticking of those final 10 minutes and the storm of fury that was about to break. 10 minutes. Time was no longer a flow. It had solidified into 10 heavy blocks of stone, and Elena had to use every last ounce of her strength to push each one forward. Her heart no longer beat. It convulsed in her chest, like a bird trapped in a box too small. Her breaths were shallow and rapid, carrying the metallic taste of exhaustion. She was no longer cleaning. She was performing a desperate dance of submission. Her trembling hands grabbed a cloth, wiping away the small streak of water at the base of the chair that Croft had pointed out. Then she looked around again, her vision blurred by sweat and stress, trying to find some invisible flaw he could use as an excuse. She re-wiped a corner of the table that was already perfect, repolished a brass handle that was already gleaming. She was fighting ghosts. From the other side of the hall, the gentle sound of jazz began to play. The clinking of crystal, the brittle artificial laughter of men and women sipping champagne and discussing multi-million-dollar deals. Those sounds seemed to come from another planet, a world she did not belong to, a world that was casually watching her slow execution. Each of their laughs was a knife twisting in her humiliation. Just then, Julian Croft broke away from his guests. This time he wasn't alone. Two men, likely the most important investors, accompanied him. He was saying something, gesturing towards the architecture of the ceiling, the polite smile still fixed on his face. But Elena knew. She could feel it. He wasn't showing off the building. He was coming for her. They were like a tribunal approaching the gallows. The other guests seemed to sense it too. Their conversations quieted, and a few glanced her way with cruel curiosity. She had become part of the show, the main entertainment of the evening. Croft stopped a few feet away from her. His shadow, elongated by the chandelier's light, swallowed her whole. "As I was saying, gentlemen," Croft said, his voice now echoing in the hall, no longer a whisper. "Perfection is in the details. Everything in my empire must adhere to that rule." Then he turned to her, the smile vanishing, leaving only a cold mask of power. His eyes didn't look at her face. They swept downwards, stopping on the metal bucket she had been using now with only a little murky, dirty water at the bottom. And then he acted. Without a word of warning, he swung his leg, the toe of his expensive Italian leather shoe, slamming into the bucket. A loud clang erupted, a jarring, violent sound of metal hitting marble. The bucket flew tumbling through the air, and all the remaining dirty water splashed out, creating a long, brownish-gray streak across the pristine white floor she had just dried. The water splattered, soiling the hem of her uniform and the shoes of one of the guests standing nearby. "Details," Croft said, his voice low, hissing through his teeth. "For instance, I don't pay to have trash sitting in the middle of my hall." The hall fell completely silent, leaving only the sound of dirty water dripping from the dented bucket. Elena stood frozen to the spot, feeling as if she herself had been kicked, not the bucket. All the strength drained out of her. She just stood there, trembling, staring at the dirty streak, the result of her desperate efforts now destroyed in a single second. "What are you doing?" Croft roared, his anger now fully unleashed, no longer concealed. "Do you have any idea how you're embarrassing me in front of my partners? What did I say, huh? The diamond must shine." He stepped forward, getting right in her face. "Or is it that people like you can't understand such concepts? That people like you only know how to dirty everything you touch?" Elena took a step back, her whole body cowering. "I'm sorry, sir. I tried." "Tried." He let out a harsh, joyless laugh. "I don't pay for tried, I pay for results. And the result I see is carelessness, laziness, and stupidity." Each of his words was an invisible punch striking her already fragile self-respect. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. Some turned away looking uncomfortable. Others watched with a cruel smirk. No one said a word. They were accomplices in their silence. Elena brought her hands up to her chest in a subconscious, defensive gesture. "Please, sir. Don't what?" he yelled, swinging his arm toward her. His hand didn't touch her. It only brushed past, but she still flinched in fear. He shoved her shoulder hard. She lost her balance, stumbling backward and hitting the edge of the wooden conference table hard. A sharp, searing pain shot from her hip through her body, but it was nothing compared to the agony tearing her soul apart. Just then, a small but determined voice rang out from the entrance of the conference room. "Stop it!" Everyone turned. Lily was standing there, no longer a frightened child hiding in the break room. She had come out. Her dark, liquid eyes no longer held anxiety, but a pure, blazing fire of anger. Her teddy bear had fallen to the floor. Her small hands were clenched into fists. "Don't hurt my mommy." The sight of a 5-year-old child standing up to a careful tycoon was absurd. It was like a sparrow trying to block a truck. But for a moment, her courage silenced the entire hall. Julian Croft turned to look at Lily. His expression shifted from rage to something far worse, utter contempt. To be challenged by an adult like Elena was an insult. But to be ordered around by a child, a janitor's child, in front of his important partners, that was unforgivable. "Get this thing out of here," he hissed, not looking at Elena, but into the empty space. But Lily didn't back down. She ran forward, standing protectively in front of her mother, spreading her small arms as if to shield her from the world. "You're a bad man," she shouted, her voice breaking with a sob. That was the final straw. Julian Croft's wounded pride transformed into an uncontrollable monster. He strode forward, swatting Lily aside. "Get lost!" The little girl fell in a heap onto the cold marble floor. And then, before Elena could react, before anyone could even draw a breath, he swung his hand. Slap! The sound wasn't loud, but in the silence of the hall, it rang out like a gunshot. A dry, ugly, and final sound. Elena's world stopped. She didn't feel the pain right away. She only felt one side of her face flare with heat, then go numb. She felt the shock travel through her jaw up to her temple. She could taste the salty tang of blood in her mouth. The world outside the Zenith Tower greeted Lily with a cold slap of the night wind. The air carried the smell of exhaust fumes and the city's dampness, a violent contrast to the sterile, artificial atmosphere inside. Her small, bare feet pounded on the cold, rough concrete sidewalk. A small, sharp piece of gravel cut into the sole of her foot, a piercing pain, but she didn't stop. The physical pain was nothing compared to the earthquake that had just shaken her entire little universe. She ran. She didn't know where she was running. She only knew she had to run to get far away from the shattering sound of the slap, from the image of her mother's reddened cheek, from the ice-cold eyes of the monster in the suit. Her small chest burned, her lungs felt like they would explode. Each ragged breath was hitched with a bitter sob. "Mommy! Mommy!" The word escaped her lips, not as a sound, but as a fragile wisp of vapor that dissolved into the night. The city at night was both enchanting and terrifying for a child. The glittering skyscrapers were like giant diamond needles. The streetlights became blurred streaks of color stretching like scars across the black velvet of the night as she ran. The distant sound of car horns, the music spilling from some bar, all of it became alien and menacing. Every person she passed was a faceless shadow. She was all alone, a tiny dot of fear and despair trying to escape a colossal shadow that was swallowing her whole. And then she saw them. Across the street, under the pale yellow light of a nearly closed roadside cafe, was a row of resting metal monsters. Huge, massive Harley Davidsons, their chrome gleaming even in the dim light. They looked like sleeping predators of iron and steel, their breath the faint scent of gasoline and leather in the air. Beside those beasts were their masters. Large men dressed in worn, rugged black leather, looking dangerous. Tattoos peeked out from their necks and arms. They were unlike anyone Lily had ever met. They looked like the villains from the movies her mother never let her watch. Instinct screamed at her to run away. But the image of her mother's swollen cheek was more terrifying. Desperation is a reckless drug. When you have nothing left to lose, you seek help in the most unexpected places. For a moment she hesitated, her feet feeling rooted to the ground. And then she took a deep breath, gathered what little courage she had left, and darted across the street. Jackson Jack's rider didn't talk much. He let his hands and his motorcycle do the talking for him. He was sitting on a rickety plastic chair outside the Last Stop Cafe, a soft cloth in his hand, meticulously polishing every chrome detail on his Fat Boy's engine. The streetlight reflected off the metal surface, creating a sharp glint of light. This polishing wasn't just about keeping the bike clean. It was a ritual. A way for him to sort through the chaos in his head. A way for him to find stillness amidst the roar of life. Beside him, Grizz, the biggest of the group, with a beard as thick as a bear's pelt, was breaking his last chocolate bar in half. He tossed one half to the scrawny stray dog sitting at his feet and ate the other half himself. The dog wagged its tail in gratitude. On the other side, Sparrow, the youngest member, was glued to his phone, his thumb swiping across the screen at lightning speed. He was their bridge to the digital world, a world the rest of them either didn't understand or didn't care about. They were the Sentinels. The name sounded grand, but in reality, they were just a collection of lost souls who had found a family in each other. They weren't a criminal gang. They had their own code, and the most important rule was never turn your back on the helpless in need. It was a rule written in blood and regret. A rule that Jax had carved into his very soul. He was polishing the last part when he heard the footsteps. Not the sound of adult shoes, but the frantic, panicked slap of bare feet on pavement. He looked up. A little girl. A little girl in a simple blue dress, her hair a tangled mess, her face streaked with tears. She ran towards them like a moth to a flame, then stumbled and fell right in front of them. All three men froze. Their noisy world fell suddenly silent. The stray dog stopped chewing its chocolate. Sparrow looked up from his phone. The little girl pushed herself up, looking up at them. The fear in her wide, round eyes was so immense, it was almost tangible, something you could reach out and touch. Her lips trembled, trying to form a sound. "Please." Her voice broke as faint as a whisper. "Help! My mommy!" Grizz was the first to make a move to stand, but Jax held up a hand, signaling for him to stay put. He didn't want to frighten her more. He slowly set his polishing cloth down. All the weariness, all the indifference on his face vanished. For a moment he didn't see Lily. He saw another child. He heard another child's cry, a cry he had failed to answer, a cry that still haunted him on the longest nights. The ghost of an old, painful failure had just risen from the deepest grave in his soul. He stood up, not with haste, but with a heavy deliberateness. He walked in front of Lily and then slowly knelt on one knee. The giant in leather with his rugged tattoos and world-weary eyes lowered himself to eye level with a trembling child. That gesture in that moment was more powerful than any words. "Easy now," he said. His voice, a complete contrast to his tough exterior, was unexpectedly deep and steady. It was an anchor in the storm. "Take a deep breath. That's right. Now tell me, who is hurting your mom?" "The man in the big building, with all the lights." Lily sobbed, pointing a small hand toward the Zenith Tower, looming in the distance, a spear of glass and steel piercing the heart of the night. He hit her." Jax didn't need to hear any more. He saw it all. The bare feet, the scraped knee, the absolute terror in her eyes. And he understood that there are lines that must never be crossed. And tonight, someone had crossed one. He stood up. He turned to look at his two brothers. He didn't have to say a word. Grizz was already on his feet, his fists clenched. Sparrow had pocketed his phone, his eyes sharpened. They had ridden together long enough to understand each other's silence. This silence meant war. "Grizz, take care of her," Jax commanded, his voice dropping several degrees. He turned back, pulling his heavy helmet over his head. He swung his leg over his iron beast, his hands expertly starting the machine. And then the night was torn apart. The Harley's engine roared to life, a deep, powerful rumble that shook the very ground. It was not a sound of chaos. It was the sound of fury. It was the sound of purpose. Immediately, two other roars answered, merging into a ferocious symphony. Lily, now held in Grizz's large, safe arms, watched as three headlights cut a path through the darkness, speeding toward the Zenith Tower like bullets fired from a gun of vengeance. The roar of the motorcycles echoed through the streets, a declaration of war sent to the complicit silence in the luxurious rooms above. Tonight, the Sentinels were on their way. And their justice wasn't written on paper. It was forged from steel leather and a vow that could never be broken. Silence descended upon the hall after the sound of Lily's bare feet faded into the night. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, thick with the unspoken. A silence of guilt, of complicity, and of a pain freshly carved into the air. For Elena, the world had narrowed to a shrill ringing in her ears. One of her cheeks was on fire, burning, and she could taste the salty tang of blood at the corner of her lip. The shock paralyzed her other senses. She no longer heard the jazz music, no longer felt the stares of those around her. Her mind screamed a single question, repeated over and over like a verdict: "Where is Lily? Where is my daughter Julian?" Croft was the first to break the silence. He had regained his false composure, but the slight tremor in his hand, as he adjusted his silk tie, betrayed him. He turned to Elena not with anger, but with a cold disgust. "Look what you've done," he said, his voice straining for calmness, but failing to hide his fury, causing a ridiculous scene, disturbing my guests. He was trying to regain control, to paint himself as the victim and her as the perpetrator. It was a familiar tactic. Elena didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the empty space where her daughter had just disappeared. She had to find her, now. She took a staggering step. "Where do you think you're going?" Croft snarled, grabbing her arm. "I'm not finished." Just then, a new sound began to creep into the hall. At first, it was just a low rumble, a deep vibration one could feel through the marble floor before truly hearing it. It was like the thunder from a distant storm, but it was getting closer. Quickly. The vibration grew clearer, morphing into a growl, a powerful rhythmic sound of multiple engines working in unison. The sound was utterly alien to this place. It wasn't the smooth purr of luxury sedans. It was a raw, primal, and defiant sound. A few guests began to exchange confused glances. Julian Croft frowned, annoyance clear on his face. "Where is security?" he muttered. The roar became deafening as three brilliant, powerful headlights cut a diagonal slash across the hall's massive glass walls. Three large, gleaming black Harley Davidson motorcycles pulled up directly in front of the main entrance. Their engines didn't cut out immediately. They let out one final defiant roar before sputtering to a stop, leaving a silence that was even more menacing than the noise before it. The automatic glass doors slid open, and they walked in. Three men. They didn't rush. They moved with a heavy confidence, as if this marble floor was made for the soles of their leather boots. The one in the lead, Jax, was tall and broad-shouldered, his Sentinel's leather jacket looking like a piece of armor. His eyes didn't wander. They swept the room once cold and focused like a predator assessing its prey. His gaze passed over the stunned guests, paused for a second, on Elena's pale face and swelling bruise, then locked onto Julian Croft. Their arrival changed everything. The balance of power, which had always tilted in favor of expensive suits and vast bank accounts, suddenly violently tilted. The smell of leather wind and faint gasoline that clung to them was a brutal invasion into this world of perfume and champagne. They were an entity from another world, a world where strength wasn't measured in money. "Who the hell are you?" Croft was the first to find his voice, but his arrogance now sounded forced. "This is private property. Get out of here before I call the police." Jax didn't answer right away. He kept walking forward, his two brothers fanning out to his sides, forming a silent human wall. He stopped a few feet from Croft. He glanced at the dirty streak on the floor, the dented bucket, then looked back into Croft's eyes. "A child's scream isn't private property," Jack said, his voice low and clear without a tremor. "We heard screaming." "I don't know what you're talking about," Croft growled, trying to save face in front of his partners. "You're trespassing. I'll sue you until you don't have a penny to your names." Jax's lips curled into a smirk that held no humor. "Be my guest. While you're at it, you might as well call the police. I'm sure they'd be interested to see the handprint on that woman's cheek." He nodded his head toward Elena. For the first time, all eyes turned away from the intruders and truly looked at Elena. They no longer saw her as an invisible janitor. They saw her as a victim. They saw the darkening bruise, the tear-filled eyes, the uncontrollable trembling. The wall of indifference had been breached. Croft froze. He hadn't expected this. He was used to people bowing to being feared. He was not used to being confronted so directly. "She fell," Croft lied clumsily. "Did she?" Jax asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He turned to Elena and his tone softened. "Ma'am, did you fall?" Elena started. She was trapped in the middle. On one side was the monster who had tormented her. On the other, dangerous strangers who had just appeared. Fear robbed her of her voice. She could only shake her head weakly. One shake of the head. But it was enough. "You heard her," Jax said, turning back to Croft. "So now you have two options. One, you apologize to her right here, right now. Or two, we wait for the police to arrive and let them decide who's right and who's wrong." Julian Croft's pride wouldn't allow him to back down, especially not in front of these men. Being ordered around by a bunch of bikers in his own building, however. "I'll give you a third option," Croft hissed, his rage finally winning over reason. "And that's to get the hell out." And he made his final mistake. He lunged forward, swinging his arm to shove Jax out of his way, but his hand never reached Jax's chest. In a movement that was lightning fast, yet perfectly controlled, Jax raised his hand not to punch, but to catch. His fingers, calloused from years of gripping handlebars, closed around Croft's wrist like a steel vice. Croft cried out in pain. The smirks on his guests' faces froze. They could hear the bones in Croft's wrist creak under the pressure. Jax's expression didn't change. He didn't look angry. He just looked disappointed. He leaned in close to Croft, who had gone pale with pain and shock. "You see, Croft?" Jax whispered, his voice as cold as ice. "You and I have a different definition of power. You think power is screaming at a defenseless woman. You think power is hitting someone who can't fight back. But you're wrong." He squeezed a little tighter. Croft dropped to one knee, his face contorted in agony. "Real strength." Jax continued, his voice the only thing audible in the hall, "is when you have the power to break every bone in a man like you's body, and you choose not to." He looked directly into Croft's terrified eyes. "Real power doesn't have to scream, Croft." He let go. Croft fell to the marble floor, clutching his wrist, gasping for air like a fish thrown on land. The king had been toppled from his throne in his own castle. The balance of power hadn't just tilted, it had been completely overturned. Just then, from the distance, a familiar authoritative sound began to grow louder and louder. The wail of police sirens. Someone among the silent guests had called, or perhaps an employee who had witnessed everything from afar. Whoever it was, justice in a more official form was on its way. Jack stepped back, standing beside his brothers. He glanced at Elena, who stood stunned, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was no longer crying from fear. She was crying from an emotion she hadn't felt in a very long time. A flicker of hope. The red and blue lights of the police cars swept across the hall, turning the pristine white marble walls into a ghoulish stage of belated justice. The dancing flashes played across the stunned faces, dyeing the expensive suits and half-drunk glasses of champagne with a color of urgency, exposing the nakedness of a world just stripped of its glamorous veneer. Two police officers walked in, one an older, seasoned veteran, with a forehead deeply lined with experience, and a younger female officer with a sharp gaze that missed no detail. They were not overwhelmed by the luxury. Their job had taken them to the grimiest slums and the wealthiest mansions, and they knew that human tragedy knows no class. The older officer walked directly toward Julian Croft, who was still slumped on the floor, his expression shifting from astonishment to indignation. "We received a report of an assault," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "Does anyone here want to explain what's going on?" Julian Croft scrambled to his feet, trying to brush invisible dust from his expensive trousers. He took a deep breath, attempting to summon his usual authority. "Good, you're finally here," he said, his voice somewhat shrill. "I am Julian Croft. I own this building, and I want you to immediately arrest this group of thugs for trespassing and for assaulting me." He pointed a finger at Jax and his friends, who stood silently, their faces expressionless. The officer didn't look at them. His experienced eyes glanced over the frightened faces of the guests, paused on the dented bucket, and then he looked directly at Elena. He saw the swelling purple on her cheek, the tear in the sleeve of her uniform, the tears still welling in her eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly softening. "Are you all right? Are you the one who was attacked?" Elena started. For the first time tonight, someone in a position of authority had asked if she was all right. Not about her work, not about her mistakes. About her. Something inside her seemed to break. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, tears beginning to stream down her face again, this time not from fear or humiliation, but from a painful, overwhelming relief. "She's lying," Croft shouted, losing all composure. "She fell. And this lot, they staged the whole thing. Do you have any idea who I am? I'll call the mayor." The officer held up a hand, a simple but authoritative gesture that cut off Croft's tirade. "Sir Croft, you'll have plenty of time to make your calls. Down at the station." He turned to the female officer. "Cuff him." The dry, cold click of the steel cuffs echoed in the absolute silence of the hall. It was the sound of a downfall, the sound of an empire built on arrogance and cruelty crumbling to dust. Julian Croft was stunned, his eyes wide with disbelief as his wrists were locked behind his back. "You can't do this to me!" he screamed, struggling uselessly. "I am Julian Croft." But that name, a name that once commanded fear throughout the city, was now just the helpless shriek of a loser. As he was led past them, his guests, the very people who had been laughing and praising him moments before, now turned away in unison, pretending to look at their phones at the ceiling, anywhere but at his pleading eyes. His world had turned its back on him as quickly as he had turned his back on humanity. As the shadow of Croft and the police officers disappeared through the doors, the adrenaline that had been keeping Elena upright suddenly vanished. The world swam before her eyes. Her knees went weak. She had no strength left. She began to collapse. But she didn't hit the cold marble floor. A strong, steady arm caught her just in time. Jax was beside her, quick as a shadow. He said nothing, simply held her, preventing her from falling completely. Elena looked up, seeing him through a blur of tears. She wanted to say thank you, but no words could escape her choked throat. Jax looked at her, the cold, steely look in his eyes gone. In their depths, she saw an understanding, a silent empathy. He saw her trembling, saw the cheap gray uniform soiled and torn. Then he did something she would never forget. He slowly took off his heavy leather jacket. The jacket bearing the Sentinel's emblem on the back, his armor, his pride. He gently draped it over her frail, trembling shoulders. The weight of the jacket immediately enveloped her, a comforting heaviness. The warmth from his body still clung to the lining, and a distinct scent, the smell of leather, of the road, of endless open highways, filled her senses. It was not the scent of artificial cleanliness from the tower. It was the scent of freedom, the scent of life. The jacket was huge on her, covering her torn uniform, hiding her shivers. It felt like a shield, an unspoken promise of protection. In that moment, for the first time in years, Elena felt safe. "Mama!" A familiar voice, broken by sobs, called out from the doorway. Grizz was walking in, carrying a small, weeping figure in his arms. Lily. He had brought her back after making sure the monster had been taken away. Elena's world narrowed to that single image. She let go of Jax's arm, stumbling toward her daughter. "Lily, oh my baby girl." Grizz gently set her down. Lily launched herself into her mother's arms. Mother and daughter embraced, holding on so tightly, it was as if they were trying to merge into one. Elena buried her face in her daughter's soft hair, breathing in her familiar scent. She cried hot tears, soaking the shoulder of Lily's dress. I thought you," Lily sobbed, unable to finish the sentence. "I'm here," Elena whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm here, mija. It's going to be okay now. I promise." They knelt there in the middle of the cold hall, mother and child clinging to each other, a small island of love in an ocean of cruelty that had just receded. Jax, Grizz, and Sparrow stepped back a little, giving them their space. They said nothing, just stood there, steady, dark figures, their unwilling guardians. A moment later, the older police officer returned. "Ms. Martinez," he said gently, "we'll need to take your statement, but not here. We'll take you and your daughter to a safe place to rest first." Elena looked up, her eyes still filled with confusion. "A safe place? Don't worry, we've got it," Jax spoke up unexpectedly. He stepped forward, standing protectively in front of them. "We'll take them to a nearby motel. Make sure they're safe." The officer looked at Jax, then at the leather jacket on Elena's shoulders. He nodded, a silent trust formed between two men from two different worlds. "All right, we'll be in touch in the morning." That night, Elena and Lily sat on the bed in a small, clean roadside motel room. The red neon light from the sign outside cast a soft glow into the room. Elena was still wearing Jax's leather jacket. She didn't want to take it off. Lily had fallen asleep in her arms, exhausted after the terrifying night. Occasionally she would startle and whimper in her sleep, and Elena would tighten her embrace, whispering words of love into her ear. She looked out the window. In the parking lot below, 3 motorcycles were parked neatly under a streetlight. 3 figures sat on their bikes, not talking, just silently watching her window. They hadn't left. They were standing guard. Elena raised a hand, touching the thick leather of the jacket. Its warmth, its weight, and its scent were a tangible reminder that she was no longer alone. Tonight, on her frail shoulders, there was a coat of armor, and out there in the cold night were guardians whose names she did not know, watching over the dawn for her and her child. As the sun rises on Elena and Lily's new life, the story reminds us that sometimes it's the most unexpected people who become our greatest protectors. From the cold, ruthless world of the Zenith Tower to the warmth of a new beginning. Elena's journey is proof that hope can be found in the most unlikely places. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales of resilience and transformation. And remember, no matter how dark the night, the dawn always comes. Stay strong, and we'll see you in the next video.